Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of human experience. Real stories of the most horrifying things that have ever happened to people. These aren't ghost stories or urban legends. These are moments of real fear, danger, and trauma that people lived through and never forgot. Some are violent, some are tragic, and some are so disturbing they'll stay with you long after the video ends. And if you have a terrifying story of your own, something that still haunts you, email it to hello@pandasdream.org. Your nightmare might be featured in a future video. Now, take a deep breath. Let's begin. Story 1. This one is kind of creepy, but also kind of comforting. The story was told to me by my grandmother, who's a nonsense kind of woman, so I believe every word of it. My grandma had a neighbor and friend who, unfortunately, lost her husband when she was still fairly young, around 40 years ago. It was a sudden death, a cardiac arrest or something like that. She was devastated, of course, but what really troubled her was the fact that, for years after his passing, she couldn't dream about him, not once. For reasons she couldn't explain, it bothered her deeply. She longed for a dream where he would appear, just one last experience of comfort or connection. Some time passed, and eventually she decided to sell her house and move closer to her children, who lived in the neighboring state. And right around then, she finally got her wish. She started having dreams where her husband appeared. In each one, the same strange thing would happen. He would sit on the edge of the bed, look at her, and begin to speak. But the way he spoke was terrifying. My grandmother described it as backwards or garbled, something similar to how the characters speak in the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks. She couldn't understand a single word, and the way it sounded disturbed her deeply. Then, just a few days before she was set to move out for good, she had another dream. This one started like all the others. Her husband appeared, sat beside her, and began to speak. But this time was different. This time, she understood one word. He grabbed her gently and repeated it over and over, looking almost panicked. The word was rafters. She woke up shaken but tried to dismiss it. The next day, as she was packing the last of her belongings in the basement, she glanced up and remembered the dream. Compelled by something she couldn't explain, she reached up into the exposed wooden rafters above her. And that's when she found them. Tucked away in the beams were thousands of dollars worth of World War II bonds. Bonds her husband had purchased without ever telling her. She swears he never once mentioned them while he was alive. They had been sitting up there, forgotten and nearly lost. Somehow he had returned, through dreams, to guide her to them, just days before she would have left the house behind forever. Even now, that story gives me chills. Story 2. I used to do hospice home care. People who are actively dying. They see things. And the thing is, it's almost always friends or family who have passed before. Or angels. Or demons. Never something random, like a dog they never owned, or a kid they never met, or a plate of spaghetti. The rational explanation. It's cultural. Even if you're not a believer, everyone hears stories about white lights, beckoning relatives, angels, and demons. So that's what people see when their oxygen levels drop, their bodies start shutting down, and their brains begin to hallucinate. But the explanation that scares the hell out of me may be people who have one foot in this world and one foot in the next. Can see things I can't. The scariest one I ever witnessed was a man who seemed completely lucid. Usually, dying patients don't make a lot of sense. They'll drift in and out, maybe say something like, "My son is here, do you see him?" and then lapse back into confusion or sleep. But this guy, he was fully in his right mind. Except, he was talking to his wife. Not about her, to her. He said she was sitting at the end of his bed. He told me she'd dyed her hair again, even though he'd always preferred her natural grey. But at least she was wearing that blue dress, the one she always looked so good in, he said. He was having a perfectly rational conversation with her. He told her he missed her, but that the doctors had said he'd see her again soon. He wasn't scared. He knew he was a very old man, and that no one lives forever. Part of me thinks he was just having a different kind of death experience, some vivid hallucination that happened to feel more grounded than most. Part of me wonders if he was just messing with me, and part of me truly believes she was there. I just couldn't see her, because I'm not dying. And what scares me the most is this thought I could never shake. What if one day I do see what they see? What then, huh? Story 3. Personally, I've had an extremely strange experience, and I still don't know whether to chalk it up to my 12-year-old brain at the time, or if it was actually something paranormal. My best childhood friend used to live in a house that was technically 2 older houses merged into one. Both were very old, creaky, and full of weird energy. The first night I ever slept over, he told me a story about the place. That a woman who used to live in one of the original houses had lost her mind one day and drowned her children in a basin out back, many years ago. It was around 4 in the morning when I woke up, thirsty and needing a drink of water. I got out of his bedroom, passed by the staircase on my right that led up to the 2nd floor, and walked into the kitchen. Nothing felt unusual. But on my way back to his room, something made me stop. For some reason, right as I passed the base of the stairs again, I froze in my tracks. I hadn't even been looking at the stairs, just moving quickly to get back to bed. But something compelled me to turn my head and look, and that's when I saw it. Instead of a staircase leading up to the 2nd floor, like I knew was supposed to be there, the stairs now slanted sharply downward at an almost impossible angle, into what looked like absolute blackness, like a void. I couldn't see a single step beyond the first few. It was just pure, pitch black emptiness. What still unsettles me to this day is that, in that moment, my brain didn't even register it as strange. I just stood there, staring. I didn't feel fear, at least not right away. I just stood at the foot of those impossible stairs, gazing into whatever it was, for what felt like 20 minutes. It was like my body had paused completely. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, a woman's voice screamed, "No, no, no," so sharp and loud, it didn't even feel like it came from the room. It felt like it came from inside my head. It was ear-piercing and immediate. That's when the paralysis broke. Needless to say, I booked it back into his room and didn't look back. I haven't really talked about it since. It's one of those things that's always lived in the back of my memory, too strange to fully understand, too vivid to dismiss. The weirdest part is that I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday, even though so many years have passed. I've probably forgotten more important things since then, but not that. Story 4. I believe that I lived in a haunted apartment. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom row home, near the professional and graduate schools. The owner was a dentist who bought it so his kids could live there while they were in school. Once they graduated, he began renting it out at a great rate to other students. The important context here is that there were a lot of residents cycling in and out. He would post ads for single bedrooms and have the prospective tenants meet the current ones. Everyone was on their own lease, so some people stayed for a couple of years, while others filtered out each school year. Also, all of the tenants were young professionals or graduate students, not partying college kids, but people in their late 20s to early 30s. Many moved out into their first homes with their soon-to-be spouses. So, why do I think it was haunted? Sometimes you'd come downstairs, and all of the kitchen cabinets would be wide open. Some people suggested sleepwalking or wandering around for midnight snacks. But it happened with a variety of different roommates, and no single person was consistently present each time it occurred. Others speculated the building was slanted and the cabinets just swung open due to gravity. But that didn't make sense either, because some of the doors opened in opposite directions. Plus, Aside from the times they all opened at once, the cabinets stayed shut just fine. Another time, the backsliding glass door, which led to a small fenced yard, became the site of something stranger. One of my roommates called me over, and we saw hundreds, maybe thousands, of large black flies slamming into the glass door. They hit the glass hard enough that you could hear the pinging. This went on for a while, until most of the flies were lying stunned or dead on the ground. The few that remained flew away. We went outside and literally swept up a dustpan full of flies. The only remotely plausible explanation we ever heard was that the flies might have been fleeing a predator. But even then, it was bizarre. There were also random leaks in the roof. That's not too weird in itself, except they didn't seem to correspond to any rain, snow, or weather of any kind. They just happened. The stains left on the ceiling looked like water, and they dripped like water. But if you put a bucket underneath to catch the leak, you'd find a sticky, brown, tar-like substance. The landlord had professionals come look at it twice while I lived there, and he told me he'd had it inspected multiple times before I even moved in. No one ever found anything to fix. Some people guessed that moisture was getting in somewhere and picking up tack or building material. Others suggested that old cigarette use can cause tar to weep from the walls with moisture. Still, the way it happened was odd. It didn't feel random. It felt patterned. Then there was the cat. When I moved in, 2 couples were moving out, and a bachelor tenant was still living there. He had a cat, which I loved. It was a huge cat, friendly in its own way, but if you tried to pick it up, it would immediately squirm out of your arms. Never scratched, never hissed, just wanted down. Then it would walk away slowly and give you side-eye. Classic cat. About a month later, the cat's owner told me he was moving out. He left, but he left the cat in the house. I made sure it had food and water, but it never seemed to touch either. It mostly stayed hidden, and that was fine with me. A week later, one of the past tenants came by to pick up the last of her things. I mentioned the cat was still there, and she and her friend looked at each other before sighing. They explained that the guy had actually 2 cats, one he cared for, and one that just kind of lurked in the basement. Apparently, he'd lied to the landlord about the second cat. 2 weeks later, the guy came back to get the final box of his stuff. I casually mentioned the cat, and he got visibly irritated. Said he only ever had 1 cat, and that cat was already gone. I let it go, but here's the strange part. Myself and the people who moved in after kept seeing the cat. We'd hear it at night. We'd see it dart around corners. We kept leaving out food. Nothing was ever eaten. At one point, we had a roommate who had rescued a severely abused pit bull. Very skittish, very reactive to other animals. The dog would freak out over squirrels and other dogs during walks, but oddly, never reacted to the presence of this cat. Not once. Even though it should have triggered a response if it was there. The rational explanation is that maybe a neighbor's cat kept sneaking in. And cats are wily, right? But still, it's weird that so many people saw it, and not one of us ever managed to catch it. Stop it, or figure out where it came from or went. It was just there, then not, but only sometimes. So that's the story of the haunted apartment, and all of the plausible explanations people have tried to offer. I should say, though, nothing bad ever happened to me there. It was just strange, subtly wrong, but not malevolent, quietly haunted, maybe, but haunted all the same. Story 5. A couple of weeks ago, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard my TV turn on in the living room. I stayed in bed for a few seconds, hoping to hear my fattest cat jump off the coffee table and take the blame. I finally got up and went out to check, and sure enough, said fattest cat was just chilling on the table by the window, nowhere near the TV or the remote. For context, the way my house is set up, my bedroom is behind the living room. The living room TV is perpendicular to the wall, not parallel, so I approached it from behind. As I walked up to the back of the TV, the second I got next to it, it shut off. The glow of the screen vanished. The sound stopped. I was 100% freaked the hell out. So, I unplugged the damn thing. I went back to bed with my heart still pounding, trying my best to convince myself that everything was totally normal. Just a fluke. No big deal. A few minutes go by, and then I hear more goddamn noise from the living room. At this point, I'm truly freaked out. I grabbed my stun baton, because maybe I could tase a poltergeist, and crept out to investigate. I poked my head into the living room. The TV was definitely not on. I stood there for a few seconds and realized the noise was coming from my laptop. The same laptop I hadn't opened in like 2 weeks. I opened the lid, and sure enough, Uterant had decided to boot up and start running pop-up ads all by itself. I muted the laptop, walked back to bed, and laid there wide awake until 4 a.m. The next morning, I texted my boyfriend about it, and he did some Googling. Apparently, TV remotes with almost dead batteries can send out weird garbage signals, which the TV sometimes interprets as the power on command. Makes sense, I guess. I've had that TV since 2011, and the remote still has the original Vizio-branded batteries. Still don't have a good explanation for the laptop though. Story 6. My best friend and I lived together in a 2-bedroom apartment during my senior year of college. We only had one key to our unit's mailbox, so we always kept it on a little table right by the front door. A few months into living there, the key went missing. My roommate swears she saw the key on the table that morning before leaving for class. She had an important piece of mail coming later that day and wanted to make sure she got it. But when she came back home, the key was gone. We looked around the house for a few days, checked every drawer, purse, pocket, nothing. Eventually, we gave up and asked our landlord for a replacement. We were both confused about how it could just disappear, but we assumed one of us must have misplaced it or accidentally taken it out of the apartment. Then, a few weeks later, we had a friend over for brunch. She was helping us out in the kitchen and went to put some cinnamon rolls in the oven. A few seconds later, we heard her say, "Why is there a key in your oven?" Sure enough, balanced perfectly across 2 wires on the middle oven rack, right in the center, was our old mail key. There is absolutely no way it could have just fallen into that position. It hadn't slid in or bounced around. It had been carefully placed there. And the weirdest part, we had just made a frozen pizza on that exact rack the night before, and it definitely hadn't been there then. Between making the pizza and making the cinnamon rolls, no one had left the apartment. There wasn't even a window of time for anyone else to have snuck in and done it. To this day, I still can't think of a plausible explanation. I've tried to convince myself that maybe my roommate was just messing with me, but the look on her face when we found that key, I know she wasn't. Story 7. When I was 12, my family lived in a house that had a very large pond behind it. Honestly, it was less of a pond and more like a very small lake. When we first moved in, the neighbor's son was always out by the water, fishing. Whenever I talked to him, he swore there was a massive catfish living in the pond. He really wanted to catch it, but never could. He claimed he knew it was there because he had seen it eat some of the baby ducks and geese. He told me he watched them get sucked under the water while swimming on the surface. I remember thinking it was kind of wild that a fish could eat baby ducks, but I didn't give it much thought beyond that. Eventually, the neighbor's son moved out. He never did catch the catfish. Years passed, and by the time I was about 16, I finally saw what he had been talking about, or at least saw something. A friend of mine was spending the night. We were just hanging out on some random weekend, staying up late, playing video games, when we suddenly heard the ducks on the pond completely losing their minds. It was around midnight. Normally, we couldn't hear the ducks from inside the house, so whatever was happening had to be loud. we decided to check it out. At first, it didn't seem like anything was wrong. The ducks were just going crazy every once in a while. Groups of about 10 to 20 ducks would suddenly fly off the pond and come back down, flapping around, making noise, just panicking. We had a lot of ducks and geese on that pond. One day my dad actually counted around 300 of them. Then we noticed it. Ducks were being pulled under. We stood there and watched as full-grown adult ducks were yanked down into the water. They didn't dive. This wasn't normal feeding behavior. They thrashed as they went down, wings flapping, necks straining upward. Something was grabbing them and dragging them under. All the ducks nearby would freak out and rush away from the spot where it happened. It wasn't just one. We saw it happen several times. Let me be clear, these were not baby ducks. These were large, healthy, adult ducks being pulled down and not resurfacing. The next day, we told everyone. But like most stories like this, almost nobody believed us. We never saw anything quite like it again, and over time, I stopped thinking about it. Until one night, something else happened. It was a cool summer night. My window was open. I was sitting on my bed, playing a game on my Nintendo SP, when I heard a sound outside. It was a sloshing, heavy sound, like someone walking in thick, wet boots through deep mud. At first, I didn't think much of it. I kept playing, but the sound got closer. It was moving along the fence line, toward the pond. That's when I jumped up and looked out the window. What I saw, I still can barely describe. At the far end of our fence, about 20 feet from the edge of the pond, was a giant brown and black mass. It was about the size of a small car. Its shape was rounded, like a huge mound of matted fur, kind of like Cousin It from the Addams Family, and near the top were two shiny black eyes. It was just standing there, and it was looking right at me. The instant our eyes met, I collapsed, just dropped to the floor in pure, overwhelming fear. I've never felt anything like that, not even close. I nearly died once from car surfing, and the fear I felt then was nothing compared to this. This wasn't just fear, it was like something ancient and wrong was looking back at me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I lay there frozen on the floor, completely helpless, listening as the thing began to walk toward the water. I heard the wet, slapping steps as it moved. Then came the sound of splashing, and then silence. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours. Eventually, I managed to crawl back onto my bed. I didn't sleep. I didn't look away from that window for the rest of the night. I still have no idea what it was, and I think about it often. Story 8. When I was a kid, I often had dreams that seemed to show future events. Nothing dramatic or life-changing, just little moments, small glimpses. I never really believed I could see the future, but it was strange enough that I'd bring it up occasionally in conversation. It kept happening here and there, quietly in the background of my childhood. Then, one night, it happened one final time, and after that, never again. In this last dream, I was walking home to my mother's house after visiting my father. To get there, I had to pass through a district that felt like something out of a Halloween movie. It doesn't exist in reality, more of a dreamland filled with fog, eerie storefronts, and a kind of playful darkness. I wasn't afraid. I love Halloween, and I actually enjoyed wandering through the strange little neighborhood. I stopped at a shop window to look at some clothes and bags on display, just soaking in the atmosphere. Suddenly, someone greeted me from above. I looked up and saw a man perched on a flagpole. He wore a black suit and top hat, had long, wavy black hair, black circles around his eyes, and a face painted completely white. But that wasn't all. He had fur-covered hands and feet, and even a monkey tail curling behind him. He was grinning widely, looking right at me and laughing in this loud, echoing way that sounded almost rehearsed. Come in, he shouted. "Little girl, don't hesitate. Don't be shy and take the chance." Come in and see." Despite every instinct telling me not to, I walked toward the door. The moment I stepped inside, it slammed shut behind me, and everything went pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, but I could feel grass under my feet, and the air had gone cold and windy. That's when I started hearing it. Laughter, monkey screeches, the roar of big cats echoing through the dark. My heart started pounding, but I couldn't turn back. A sudden flash of light lit up the space in front of me. Another man appeared, also dressed in a suit and top hat, but he looked different. His hair was short and blonde, and he seemed more gentle, almost like he was trying to calm me down. He told me not to be afraid, that I should just enjoy myself and have fun. I tried to speak, to ask questions, to say I was scared and confused, but no sound came out of my mouth. I kept trying, but nothing. The light grew brighter and brighter until the whole space around us was glowing. Out of the white light came surreal images, clown faces flickering through the haze, tigers leaping past, monkeys howling with laughter. Everything spun around me, and the dizzy feeling took over. It all swirled together until I finally blacked out, and then I woke up in my bed. At school that day, I didn't think much of the dream. I had already forgotten most of it. I went to class, went to lunch, and grabbed my tray like I always did. But when I picked up my dessert, I froze. It was a candy bar I'd never seen before in my life, called Mr. Tom. And when I looked closer at the wrapper, I saw clowns, monkeys, and tigers printed across it. The exact same things from the dream. I had never heard of that candy bar. I'd never seen it in a store, never seen anyone eat it, never heard anyone mention the name, and yet, there it was. We were suddenly being served it as dessert at school the very next day. To this day, I tell myself I must have seen it somewhere before, maybe without realizing it. Maybe I'd glimpsed the wrapper and forgotten it. Maybe it was a coincidence. But it still creeps me out how specific it all was. I remember thinking at the time that Mr. Tom had followed me out of the dream, and for at least a week, I was terrified to fall asleep again. After that day, I never had another dream about the future. Not once. Story 9. Before my parents split up, we used to live in this huge old house. It was leaky, drafty, and nearly 100 years old. The original plan was to renovate it, but I guess life got in the way. We lived there until I was about 14. The house had 2 floors, and all of our bedrooms were upstairs. The largest part of the second floor, though, was dominated by the attic. It was a creepy attic, full of discarded things, both from our family and the previous owners. I knew it pretty well, even though I was terrified of it. My best friend and I used to hide things up there, stuff we didn't want our parents to find. A stolen baseball bat, fireworks, things like that. Things 10 to 14-year-olds tend to stash away. The attic had an old wooden door with a key in it. It was always locked unless someone was inside. My bedroom shared a wall with that attic, and ever since I was a kid, I struggled with what the doctors called insomnia. I had a big secret, though I always slept with a nightlight on, hidden under the covers and pillows until I turned 14. I would strategize how to sleep in ways that made the bed look empty, sometimes lying under the mattress or covering my head completely with pillows. The reason? Almost every night, I would hear noises from the attic, things shifting, moving. Most often, it sounded like someone was rolling heavy balls, like bowling balls, across the attic floor. Sometimes there were knocks on the walls. Other times, I would hear something that sounded like whispers, faint and low, like a conversation I wasn't supposed to catch. My best friend and I would sometimes build up the courage to explore the attic during the day, never alone, and always with the door wide open. I became obsessed with trying to find those rolling balls. I could write off the knocking sounds, old houses creak and settle, but the rolling, and especially the whispers, those had no explanation. We never found any balls. Never found anything up there that could have made those specific sounds. I'm sure there could be a rational reason, but I never found one. And the strange thing is, even though I don't believe in the supernatural, I still get scared when I think about that attic. We moved when I was 14. I remember the first night in the new house. I turned off all the lights, laid my head on the pillow, and slept soundly. Just like that. I've slept well ever since. A couple of years ago, I brought it up with my mother. I told her about the sounds I used to hear from the attic. She went quiet, and then her face changed. She looked genuinely afraid. All she said was that she didn't want to talk about it. And that was the end of that conversation. Story 10. When I was 8 years old, my bedroom was on the second floor of our house, with the window facing the street. I loved that room, mostly because of the street light just outside. At night, it would bathe the entire space in a warm orange glow, which for someone terrified of the dark, like I was and still am, brought a strange sense of comfort. One night, I'd stayed up reading. I had just discovered Percy Jackson when I heard a rustling sound. At first, I chalked it up to my cat, but then I glanced toward the doorway and saw her curled up asleep in the hallway. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from outside. I was scared, of course, but curiosity won. I couldn't not look. I sat up slowly, rose to my knees, and peeked out the window. Down in the flower bed, crouched in our lavender bush, was a man. He wore a faded black hoodie and jeans, and his skin, especially his hands, was so pale it practically glowed in the combined moonlight and lamplight. I froze, confused more than anything. If someone wanted to break into the house, why pick the brightly lit front yard, directly below a second-floor window where someone was clearly still awake? Even stranger, he wasn't looking toward the house at all. He was facing the street, as if waiting, or watching for something. I ducked back under the covers, heart racing. I didn't know what else to do, but the next night, he returned, and the night after that. For 12 nights in a row, he came back to that same spot, always crouching in the lavender, always staring at the street, bathed in the orange glow. I still don't remember why I never told my parents. Maybe I convinced myself it wasn't real. Maybe I didn't want it to become real by saying it aloud. Then came the 13th night. I was watching him again from behind the curtain. He had been motionless, like always, until he wasn't. Something changed. He didn't just pause. He froze. It was like someone had turned him to stone mid-breath. And then, slowly, he stood up. He was tall, unnaturally tall. My window is at least 15 feet above the ground, and somehow his head nearly reached the sill. But his proportions were still human, like only his legs were impossibly long. Or maybe he was standing on something, though there was nothing visible beneath him. He turned his head toward me, and even though I was staring right at him, I saw nothing. There was no face. It wasn't just blank, it was shadow. A total void where his features should have been. The streetlight should have lit up his face. The glow from my room should have revealed something. But I could see right through the darkness to the back of his hood, like his head wasn't even there. And still, I felt his eyes. Like they weren't looking at me, they were inside me. I felt them slither beneath my skin, crawling into every nerve, every muscle. A rush of dread like molten lead filled my chest. My whole body went wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Like his presence had poured darkness directly into me. Then he lifted his hand, that white, fingernailless hand, and made a gesture. The she motion, right where his mouth should have been. And then he turned around and disappeared. He didn't vanish slowly or walk away. He was just gone, like he'd never been there at all. For years, I convinced myself it was a dream, a recurring nightmare, maybe something I wrote in a story or imagined in a book. My memory filled in the gaps, I told myself. It wasn't real. Until a month ago. I'm 20 now, living in a third-floor apartment. I had just finished some late-night math studies and went to close my window. The desert gets cold at night, and there he was. He stood in the bushes below, just like before, watching, waiting. His head no longer reached the window, but his presence was unmistakable. I felt it immediately, that same wave of dread, that same nausea, the same dark rush under my skin. He raised his hand, and then he was gone again. Still doubting myself, I checked the bushes the next morning, and I found them. 2 columns of crushed leaves and snapped branches, exactly where he had stood. And that's the end of tonight's collection of real-life horror. If these stories rattled you, or reminded you just how fragile normal life can be, make sure to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more intense, emotional, and haunting stories. Hit that like button, follow for updates, and check out the other videos on this channel if you're brave enough to keep going. And don't forget, if you've experienced something horrifying yourself, I want to hear it. Send your story to hello@pandasdream.org, and you just might hear it here. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.